Can we talk a little bit about PTSD
Yeah,
and
yeah,
MDMA?
yeah.
There's this fascinating paper came out on a fascinating study that you're a part of. That's a phase 3 study. Can you describe what the study is? Can you describe what phase 3 means?
Yeah.
Can you describe what the findings are and why it's
Yeah.
in fact so important and impactful?
Yeah, this study came out May 10th in Nature Medicine. So one of the highest impact factors in medicine journals. It was tremendous. So to make a drug into a medicine, the first thing you need to do is what are called non-clinical or preclinical studies, meaning safety established in animals. What does the drug do? What are the side effects in animals? Where do you see the risks? And then you negotiate with FDA to do phase 1 studies.
Mm-hmm.
And phase 1 studies are where you move from animals to humans. And those are more safety studies and trying to describe what the drug does so that you can determine if there is potential medical value there. Certain drugs like cancer drugs are so toxic that you don't have phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. It's like phase 1/2, where it's you bring in the patients, but you still are doing sort of dose response safety studies, but you use patients. But most phase 1 studies are healthy volunteers. Phase 2 are where you start bringing in the patients and you start experimenting with various different things. The purpose of phase 2 is really just to design phase 3. Now, again, I'm sort of putting out of the picture in another areas, mechanism of action. How do these drugs work? Phase 2, you're trying to figure out what they do, who your patient population is, what are the risks, who do you include, who do you exclude, what are the doses, what is your treatment, what are your measures. In our case, it was, how do you do a double-blind study? That was a big part of phase 2. That's a big challenge for psychedelic drugs. Any kind of drugs that have a real strong effect, how do you do a double-blind study?
Double-blind, sorry to interrupt, would mean that the patient should not be aware whether it's a placebo or not.
And the researchers.
And the researcher is not aware. And
Yeah.
so for that lack of awareness, when the effect is really strong, it's very difficult to do on both the researcher and the patient side.
Yes. And sometimes
fascinating.
They talk about triple blind. So the other part is the raters that evaluate the symptoms and before and after. So you ideally want triple blind. You want the patients, the researchers, and the evaluators of the outcomes, all of them, not to know what the drug, whether it was drug or placebo, and that's to reduce experimenter bias. So, and then you move to phase 3. Once you've figured out how to design the phase 3 studies, and phase 3 are the large-scale multi-site, placebo-controlled, double-blind studies where you must prove safety and efficacy in order to get permission to market the drug. Now, for us, when we started MAPS in 86, as I said, it was 1 year after the criminalization of MDMA in 85, we had 5 different protocols that were rejected by the FDA for studying with MDMA. And these were all various phase 1 studies. They came from Harvard, from UC San Francisco, from the University in Arizona, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, all over. And they were all rejected. 1992, 6 years after we started, we got the first permission for phase 1. And that took us through much of the 90s. Again, things are slow because we have to raise the money through donations. And then in 1999 is when we started the work with PTSD. And that then took us till November 29th, 2016, which is when we had the end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. So it took 30 years from the start of MAPS to the end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. And what we had discovered during phase 2 was several different key points. The drugs that are available right now for PTSD, the SSRIs, Zoloft and Paxil, that have been approved by FDA and regulators in Europe as well, the European Medicines Agency, for PTSD, they work better in women than in men, and they failed in combat-related PTSD. All right, so what we learned is that MDMA-assisted therapy works just as well in men or women, and it works in combat-related PTSD. It works in regardless of the cause of PTSD. We also discovered that even though there are stories that, people take MDMA at raves and they dance all night and they overheat and they get hyperthermia and they die from overheating, which is true and can happen from pure MDMA, or that sometimes people have heard about needing to cool down, and so they drink water and then while they're dancing all night, and then they drink too much water and then they dilute their blood and they die from hyponatremia. Mm-hmm. So there are risks of MDMA, but we discovered that in a therapeutic setting, we can control all those risks. Those things don't happen at all. Mm-hmm. So we discovered safety. We could demonstrate safety. We also figured out that our measure, the CAPS, the clinician-administered PTSD scale, that it's the gold standard all over the world for measuring PTSD symptoms. It's what the FDA and the EMA require. We discovered that it was a good measure for us and that we could show changes in that. Mm-hmm. The other big thing that we learned is that, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but the work in the 50s and 60s with LSD and psilocybin and the modern research over the last 20 years with psilocybin and classic psychedelics has demonstrated that there's a link between this mystical experience, this unitive mystical experience, and therapeutic outcomes for the treatment of addiction, for working with people with life-threatening illnesses, that for OCD, for obsessive compulsive disorder, that there's, with the classic psychedelics, both in the 50 years ago and then the research now has been that there's a link between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcome. What we discovered is that that's not the case for MDMA. That people do score fairly high on the scales of mystical experience, not as high as they do with the classic psychedelics, but they do score pretty high on average. And a significant number of them have over the cutoff for what would be considered a full mystical experience. So enough to say that we could look at a correlation, and we didn't find any. The other thing that we discovered, and this was more humbling, I would say, for me personally, is that my dissertation at the Kennedy School, a big part of it was on it's about the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. Mm-hmm. Big part of my dissertation was how to do the double-blind study. And I thought I'd solved the problem, and I persuaded my dissertation committee that I'd solved the problem. And the solution was therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. Mm-hmm. And everybody knows that they're going to get MDMA. Most of these people have never done it before. They'll be confused about, is it full dose or low dose? And then the challenge is to pick a dose that's high enough so that there is this confusion, but not so high that it's so therapeutic that we can't tell the difference between the groups. So we studied 0, meaning inactive placebo, 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 125, and 150. What we discovered is that my dissertation was wrong and that there is no good solution to the double-blind problem. What we found is that, to our surprise, actually, was that 75 milligrams was an effective dose.
Oh, wow.
We didn't think that. I mean, the normal dose is like, full dose is like 125 milligrams, mm-hmm. something like that. But 75 milligrams was an effective dose. And we discovered that the lower doses, so I was half right, you could say. The doses, 25, 30, 40, 50, they could produce enough confusion that you could say that they were successful at blinding. Not perfectly, but enough confusion so that therapists couldn't know for sure, so that there was this reduction of bias, you could say. But what we discovered, again, to our surprise, was that the low doses made people uncomfortable. They stimulated them, but they didn't reduce the fear. And so people still got better with the therapy with low-dose MDMA. But if we gave them therapy with inactive placebo, they did even better than if we gave them therapy with low-dose MDMA. Mm-hmm. So we call it an anti-therapeutic effect. Wow. I don't mean to imply that they got worse, but it made people uncomfortable. People didn't like it, but we would still help them make some progress. So we had the blinding, but what it meant by reducing the effect of therapy with inactive placebo is that it would make it easier for us to find a difference between the two groups. And so the real question is, if you can do it with therapy, why bother add a drug? So we went to the FDA, and and so this was what we discovered during phase 2. We went to the FDA at this end of phase 2 meeting, and we said, we can give you blinding, but it will make it easier for us to find a difference between the two groups. And so we suggest that we do therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA. That will cause a problem because most people will be able to tell what they've got.
Yep.
What Tom Loughran, a doctor who used to be head of psychiatry products at FDA, is our main advisor. So the first thing he said is that the double blind fails in practice a lot, even with SSRIs, because there's certain side effects that you have with these drugs. And the doctors who are doing these research, when you're reporting your side effects, they can say, oh, that's probably you got the active drug instead of the placebo. So the double blind is, in theory, is terrific, but in practice, it doesn't always work quite as well.
Yes.
And so what Tom said is that there are two main approaches that they think are important to reduce bias. The first one is easy to do. It's called random assignment. So, sometimes there's studies where, you'll treat a bunch of people with something, and some fraction of them will get better and some won't. And then you say, okay, all those who didn't get better, who volunteers to get this new treatment? And then you give them the new treatment. But the people that volunteer are more likely to want to get better. They're not representative sample of everybody that has the disease. So when you have random assignment, everybody is similarly motivated and meets the same inclusion-exclusion criteria. So that's what we told. Of course, we need random assignment. The other part was when the bias double blind doesn't work as well, then the system of independent raters is especially important of how you do that. So we have over a pool of raters, over 20 of them, and we do this monthly inter-rater reliability tests to make sure that they evaluate this, so that they're given a videotape of a PTSD patient, and then they're supposed to rate them according to their symptoms. And then we sort of make sure that we've got this calibrated rater pool. And it's all done by Zoom, by telemedicine, and they're randomly assigned to the next person that needs a rating.
So you said 20 raters.
Yeah, so we've got like 20 raters, and what we want to do is make it so that each rater sees each patient only once, maybe twice, but not tracking them through the study. So that tries to reduce the bias in the raters, that they don't know where this person is in the study.
Yes.
And so there's a fellow, Bob Temple, who's like the old wise man at the FDA. He's been there since 1972. He was in charge of the Office of Science Policy, and they brought him into the final meeting of this process where we are trying to design phase 3. So once FDA said, yes, you can go to phase 3, that was November 29th, 2016, we then negotiated for 8 months on the design of phase 3 and all of the other information
this is fascinating
is going to need.
This process of design.
It was, to the extent that I have any artistic creativity, it's in protocol design. I really love that.
So you enjoy this process?
I love it. I love it because it's always trade-offs, and it's it's and I acknowledge that we are all biased, and so how do you? There's something beautiful about the scientific process designed to get you to the truth.
Especially when that scientific process is trying to get to the truth of the human organism, which is so complicated. So it's very difficult to dissect, to get the strong effects. And when you're analyzing, when you have like raters, they're watching a video, there's removing subjectivity from that is very, very challenging.
Yeah, very, very much so. And so we came to this agreement with FDA, though, that we would use this independent rater pool, and so we learned in phase 2 again that the double blind, there was no solution to the double blind problem, and both the FDA and the European Medicines Agency in the end agreed that the best design was therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA, accepting the fact that most people will be able to tell whether they got nothing or they got full dose MDMA. Most therapists will be able to tell the difference, but that makes a harder test for us to show a difference between the two groups because we're giving them inactive placebo and not the anti-therapeutic effect of low dose MDMA. So once we started phase 3, so then we were able to start in 2018, phase 3. And the paper in Nature Medicine that just came out was the results of our first phase 3 study. We came to agreement with FDA that we would do 2 phase 3 studies. Each would have 100 persons in them. And what the FDA said to us is that they thought that we could prove efficacy with smaller numbers than they wanted to see for safety. The reason they said that is that in phase 2, we had a large effect size. So from a statistical point of view, the bigger of an effect that you're looking for, the fewer number of people you need to get statistical significance. When you're trying to find small differences, you need large numbers of people to sort of work out the noise. So we came to agreement on 2 100-person phase 3 studies.
And the idea is that it's very possible that the first study would show the efficacy because the effect is so strong.
Yeah, and the second, but also safety as well. So one of the things we also realized when you work with a highly stigmatized drug in the midst of still, the drug war and prohibition, that we need highly sympathetic subjects. And we need to make the best case we can, which means we need to work with the hardest cases so that this is really needed. And so we end up enrolling people. The first study was chronic severe PTSD. And unlike many studies of PTSD, we enroll people that have previously attempted suicide.
Wow.
So we have multiple people that have tried to kill themselves that we felt like if we were to exclude them, what are we doing? Those are the people that need it the most. So we came to this agreement with FDA. We're going to work with chronic severe PTSD patients, including those that had attempted suicide. And we would do these 2 100-person studies. And we also negotiated what's called an interim analysis. So what that means is that when the study is underway, and often big studies, they have this kind of interim analysis where what you do is, and for us, we negotiated when we had 60% or 60 people had reached the primary outcome measure and all 100 had been enrolled, then we would take a look at the data. And if the statistical analysis that we did was showing, based on a certain effect size that we chose based on what we saw in phase 2, the interim analysis is for what's called sample size re-estimation. So what it means is if the results aren't as good as you thought they would, you can add more people, and then you'll get statistical significance. It means that your effect isn't as strong as you thought. It'll be harder to get insurance to cover it, but FDA will still approve it because FDA also believes that these are group averages. There may be some people that will later figure out respond better than others. So they'll approve it if it's statistically significant, even if it has a low effect size. The SSRIs have low effect size. So we did the interim analysis in March of 2020. And what we discovered, to our delight, was that we did not need to add any subjects. That's all we were told. We weren't told, what is the results? We were just told all we were going to get is a number, 0, or you need to add X numbers of people to the study to get statistical significance. That's right around the time that COVID hit and the lockdowns happened. And we ended up negotiating with FDA that we would end the study with 90 people instead of 100. It took a while for us to end up doing that. So the paper that we just published is on the results of 90 people. I think it was 46 in the MDMA group, 44 in the placebo group. And what we discovered was that the study worked better than we had even hoped. So the first thing is that you look at statistical significance. You have to get 0.05, which basically means a nickel out of a dollar, a 1 in 20 chance that the difference between the two groups is due to some random factor rather than to your intervention. And in this case, the placebo group gets therapy, and then with inactive placebo, and then the group gets MDMA with active placebo. So you have to get 0.05. There's another measure that the FDA uses sometimes called robust, which means 1 in 1,000. Instead of 1 in 20, 1 in 1,000. And if you get a robust result, 0.001, and you meet some other criteria, they might agree to approve the drug on the basis of just one phase 3 study instead of two. Because when you think about it, a 1 in 20 chance for your phase 3 study, a 1 in 20 chance for your second phase 3 study, you multiply that together, it's 1 in 400, 0.025. That's pretty good. So robust, 0.001, is even better than two independent phase 3 studies, each at 0.05. What we ended up getting was 1 in 10,000, 0.0001.
Wow.
Outrageous.
Yeah.
Incredibly. So that's a measure of both the difference between the two groups and the variability. And so what it meant is that we had minimal variability, that most people who got the MDMA got quite a large amount of benefit from it. And most people who got the placebo were more or less in the same range as well.
That's really exciting, by the way. I mean, I suppose it's exciting from a perspective of approval by the FDA. Maybe perhaps that's the way you're seeing it, but it's also exciting because it has a chance to help people that are truly suffering. Yeah.
Well, if we can get 1 in 10,000 in the first phase 3 study, chances are we can get 1 in 20 in the second. So it's really going to be about safety for us in the second phase 3 study.
Yeah.
Now, you can have a large p-value, large significance, but you could have an effect that's not very significant. It's not clinically significant. You can have statistical significance without clinical significance. And as I said, the more people you get in the study, you can find smaller and smaller differences between two groups. Now, we showed that we had a very large effect size. So effect size is based on...
that scale you mentioned?
Well, the scale of the effect size is based on standard deviations. So an effect size of 1 means that your results are 1 standard deviation away from the norm. That's considered very large. The SSRIs, because they were like 0.3, 0.4 effect size, that's considered small effect size. Medium is starting to be around 0.6, and 0.8 and above are large effect sizes. We had what's called placebo-subtracted effect size. There's two different ways to look at it. Placebo-subtracted means you kind of look at the difference between your two groups. And what that is for us, since one group had therapy and one had therapy plus MDMA, the placebo-subtracted effect size is basically the effect of just the MDMA, because you've kind of washed out the therapy. That was 0.91. So we had a large effect size, which was great.
Wow, so 0.91 over just the therapy, so over the placebo.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, when we do the within group, meaning the group that just got the MDMA plus therapy, look at their baseline and their outcomes. That's another way to look at it. And that's what's going to actually happen in practice, because people are going to get MDMA plus therapy. That's 2.1 effect size. 2 standard deviations away from the norm is enormous effect size.
Yeah.
The other part is that we had no effect by site, which is very important. So we had 15 sites, 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, 11 throughout the United States. The FDA looks at, is there a side effect? Because what that might mean is maybe you've got all your patients or most of your patients going to this one site, which is these highly experienced therapists, and they're like, hippies from way back, and they're super experienced with psychedelics, and, and they're getting great results, but nobody else gets good results. So we had no effect by site, which means
that's incredible
that we've been able to train all these new therapists. We had about 80 therapists working at all these 15 sites. We also discovered that there's a group that's considered to be very difficult to treat, which is called the dissociative subtype. So when people are traumatized, one of the ways to psychologically survive that is you dissociate. It's like you're not there.
Yeah.
When you do that, though, it's hard to come back, because when you come back, then you get all these painful memories and fearful. And so the extreme of that is called dissociative identity disorder, kind of like schizophrenia, almost dissociative identity. So we let people in who are on the dissociative subtype, and those are considered to be the hardest to treat, because the theory is that you need to be ego intact. As I said, the mystical experience is not correlated with therapeutic outcomes. And you need to be talking about what traumatized you and working through that and expressing it, letting it out, not keeping it in. So the dissociative subtype seems like it's harder for them to get back into the event because they're so dissociated. What we showed is that those people did even better on average than everybody else. So that MDMA is integrative. It helps people who are so separate that they make even more rapid progress.
So it's almost like the MDMA made it more difficult for them to dissociate.
Yes. Yeah. Or you could say it made it easier for them to remember.
Yes, exactly. To reverse the dissociation.
Yeah. And we find that MDMA enhances memory for the trauma. So that you can have these unconscious memories or memories that you cannot remember or that you've suppressed so much, but they distort your view. Your filter of the world is distorted by these fearful memories that the world can't be trusted, people can't be trusted, it's always about to happen. So we find that MDMA increases memory for the trauma, but by reducing the fear, then the memories can come to the surface. Then you can process them, let out the emotions, cry, scream, shake, whatever. And then through this MDMA effect on the amygdala and the hippocampus, it helps you store these memories into long-term storage so that they're not always about to happen. They're in the past. They're part of your story, but they're not the whole story. So we discovered that the dissociative subtype works better. Now, none of this would be enough unless safety. So from a safety perspective, what we discovered is that there was one woman in the study that attempted to kill herself twice during the study. There was another woman that was so worried that she might kill herself, that the therapy brought these things to the surface that she's been pushing away, that she checked herself into a hospital in order to avoid self-harm. At the end of the study, what we learned is both of them were in the placebo group. We didn't have anybody in the MDMA group attempt to kill themselves. So the MDMA is really helpful for giving people a sense of hope. And that they can somehow process this. Now, it's not to say that nobody will ever commit suicide. That's our big concern in the second phase 3 study. As I said, it's more going to be about safety than about efficacy. We think we'll get the efficacy, but we're very concerned about, safety. Because we had problems in the first phase 3 study of somebody trying to kill herself twice in the placebo group, it's the background for having PTSD. So there'd have to be a disproportionate number of people in the MDMA group try to kill themselves or succeed in killing themselves than in the placebo group for the FDA to say, oh, this MDMA, it's too dangerous. We don't think that's going to happen. So those are, the other findings are that from safety is that the side effects are transitory. They're minor. They're sweating or jaw clenching or, slight temperature increase. And, everybody that's been to a rave knows about, taking ecstasy, there are some side effects, but they're minor, they're transitory. And there has been this massive problem of, during the 80s, the 90s, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, was trying to say that MDMA was neurotoxic and that you take it and it's going to cause nerve terminal degeneration. It's going to be major brain damage. It's going to be significant functional consequences. And back then they were saying that MDMA is too dangerous. It should never even be researched. Nobody should even get it once because it's poison and brain damage. Well, we no longer believe that. That was exaggerated. That was, in service of the drug war. But we've done in phase 2 neurocognitive tests before and after in 2 of our different sites and showed no decline in cognitive functioning. So we don't think that there's any neurotoxicity happening in the doses that we use. There's no obvious functional consequences. People are getting better. The other thing that we've learned in phase 2 and that we still have to learn from this study. So what we showed is that is the durability of the effect. We showed that 32% of the people that got the therapy without MDMA at 2 months after the last experimental session no longer had PTSD, just with the therapy, which is phenomenal because these are, on average, 14 years PTSD. 1/3 had PTSD over 20 years. And just with the therapy, 32% no longer had PTSD at the 2 months. However, those people that got MDMA, it was 67%. No longer had PTSD, more than twice as good. In phase 2, and in phase 3, we're also going to do the 12-month follow-up. That's not for the FDA. That's not for approvability. That's more for insurance companies, because this is expensive, a lot of therapy time. If it fades, if it's great results initially, but then it fades after 6 months, what's the point? And what we showed in phase 2 is that people keep getting better. At the 2-month follow-up, they're doing pretty well, but at the 12-month follow-up, they're even better. So it's durable. People have learned how to process trauma. They keep getting better. So we've not reached that point in this phase 3 study where everybody's got their 1-year follow-up. But we have also done 3.5-year follow-ups to some of the groups that were in phase 2 and showed that it was durable. And we're doing a long-term follow-up now to everybody, to many of the people in phase 2. Some of them treated 15 years ago. So that's all more for the insurance companies. So basically, what we found in the paper that we just published is that it was highly efficacious, highly significant, no effect by sight, works in the hardest cases, and the safety record was great.
That's an incredible success, and that's really exciting, especially given that the people who attempted to commit suicide were let into the study, and so these are people who are truly suffering. I mean, that's incredibly exciting, and I mean, just to speak to the frustration why things can't move faster, but for what it is, it's incredibly exciting.